How's it going, everybody? Thanks for joining us this evening. Super excited for today's second podcast for the American Academy of Sports Physical Therapy. Today's topic is going to be wearable tech for running, something that is somewhat near and dear to my heart for the runners I work with. And we have an amazing panel and can't wait to kind of get into it with you guys. So if you're ready, sit back and let's... So again, I am Scott Greenberg. I am the membership chair and in charge of this wonderful podcast. And like I said, I have an amazing group of panelists here with me today. My background, just so you guys know, PT, work in Florida, Gainesville, Florida, work at the University of Florida, work with Shands Hospital. Been doing this for a long time, and running is something that's near and dear to my heart. Matt, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. This is so I'm pretty excited that we got to be the second podcast with Cross Country right around the corner. This is perfect timing, doing this now. I'm a assistant professor at the University of South Dakota. I'm the director of the sports physical therapy residency there. Running's near and dear to my heart. I'm the education chair for the running SIG. And with us today, we got Rich Willey. He's the associate professor at the School of Physical Therapy and Rehab Sciences at the University of Montana. He's also a scientist and instructor at Montana Running Lab. He's authored tons of papers specific to runners, and he's been featured in Runner's World and Outside Magazine plenty of times. And then Jenna Zajac has a passion for running, working with runners of all levels. She earned her DPT from Nazareth University, and she went on and received her PhD from Rehab Sciences from Boston University, where she focused on wearable sensors, metabolic testing, and biomechanical analysis to optimize movement, efficiency, and performance. Jenna works at the Boulder Run Physio in Boulder, Colorado, which services runners of all ages and ability levels, and it's kind of best known for working with elite level athletes as well. So thank you, everybody, for joining us here. And we want to keep this kind of pretty conversational and really kind of hopefully with some good nuggets of information, take home points. So I want to get us kicked off here. And either Rich, I want to start you off with this question. What populations do you find using wearable technology most useful for a performance perspective when you think about for performance? Do you feel like this benefits from it?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on board. This is a great topic, and I love talking about it, and it's really something that clinically I got asked a lot about as well. So yeah, I mean, I think for me, we use them for a couple different reasons, but from a clinical standpoint, we use them a lot during that return to run process. I think that's probably the most helpful time period. I really like using them a lot with people who are recovering from some sort of bone stress injury, particularly lower limb, or tibial. Tibial is a key example of that. And then from a research standpoint, we use them a lot when we're monitoring loads we do a lot of load carriage related studies. And so we do a lot of that for estimating loads in the field for our field studies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what examples are you using? Are we talking like Garmin's? Are we talking TomToms? Are we doing Oura rings? Are they IMUs? What do you find most useful?
Yeah, I mean, I think gosh, almost every wearable device that's out there we've used at some point in our lab or in clinical practice. So I think the one that's probably the easiest to use is going to be like a GPS, just a runner's GPS watch. I think that can tell you just about everything that you need. I think for most runners, if the device counts steps, it typically has the capability of giving you real-time feedback on running cadence, which is one of the main running modifications that we use them for. We've been using the Garmin devices for a long time. It's just there's Suunto, their devices do the same thing, and some of the other ones out there. It's just Toyota, Honda. They're all pretty good at this point when it comes to the basic GPS functions, and as well as like counting steps and giving real-time feedback on cadence. We're just most familiar with that kind of that whole Garmin ecosystem, if you will. So we use those a lot. We've been using this. I've grabbed a couple here from our lab that we use. So Garmin has this device here, which is the HRM Pro. Used to be the HRM Run when it was just designed for that, but it's a heart rate monitor. So I think most people recognize this heart rate monitor strap that I don't think a lot of people enjoy wearing too much. But the nice thing about it is it's got an accelerometer embedded in it, and we use this device quite a bit because it can estimate quite accurately vertical oscillation and some other metrics. We've used things like these inertial measurement units. We don't use those really that much anymore. The devices that we're starting to use more and more, though, are some sort of pressure insole. So we use these quite a bit, and they can be mostly using them now from a research standpoint. But I think you're going to start to see those, work their way into clinical practice a little bit more. We find them to be really quite useful for a couple different purposes.
What metrics, Rich, are you getting from those pressure insoles, and which brand are you using there?
Yeah, I have two here. This is from LoadSole. This is a German company, and then the other one we have is Extensor. I know it looks kind of wide, but what it does is that it kind of wraps up inside the shoe a little bit, if you will, so it doesn't move a lot. And this is a very sticky outside part of the insole. This is a company out of Calgary. I really like both these a lot, particularly this one, because it can log data for up to 8 hours. So not that most people are going out and running that long, but you can have someone go out for a run and let's say they've had a history of like bone stress injuries, like on their metatarsals. These devices are, from a resolution standpoint, are really quite good at showing the distribution of the force across the forefoot. And so if someone's, for instance, they've got a history of a fifth metatarsal bone stress injury and they're really loading the lateral side of their foot, that can really help guide some things such as, I don't know, shoe prescription or maybe even some sort of foot orthoses. And we know that people run a little bit differently outside than they do in our clinics or in our labs. So I think that looking at people and the way that they run outside, I think matters a lot. LoadSoles, these guys are, this one will look at pressure distribution the whole way through the foot. And
is that relative pressure or absolute?
It gives you both, and also gives you normal force too. So it gives you like your vertical ground reaction force, if you will. It's a really good estimate of that. So that part's really nice. And this one does the same thing. This one just gives you force. And if you can see how there's a hinge there. This is actually divided into a forefoot pressure and a rear foot. You can also get another one that has a third here, so it can give you forefoot, midfoot, and rear foot. This just gives you force, and so that part's kind of nice too. It's basically like running with a force plate inside your shoe. We find runners don't like this one as much because it's a little, the foot slides on it. These stick really well, I think, are the runners that we work with when we put them in their shoes. They don't necessarily notice them very much when they're out running about. There's a data logger that hooks onto the side of the shoe, and I would say that it is conspicuous. And I think most people, when they're running around town, kind of feel, or when they're doing like our field trials, feel like they think people are looking at them like they're under house arrest. But it is a necessary component. And like with all things with technology, that data logger is going to just get smaller and smaller over time. So I don't know, like these things are they're pretty pricey. And so we get them with our research grants. But I know a lot of clinicians who use them. And I think they can be quite helpful, but they are more expensive because, as you can imagine, you have to buy a host of sizes for these, and they can be kind of expensive versus like a simple Garmin like this. You only need one of those, and again, these are quite accurate. We have a paper coming out hopefully in the next 6 months that we've done a lot of validation work with these, and we can even estimate vertical ground reaction forces with these devices with an algorithm that we've developed in our lab quite accurately. So, so I think these devices are getting less and less expensive, easier to use. I think this gives us a lot of information for a very specific question, which is like, what's the pressure distribution under a person's foot? But I don't know if this is going to be something that someone's going to want to wear all the time versus this is going to be a lot easier because it gives you a really good estimate of applied load to the person. But if you're using the heart rate function, you can also get a metric of internal training load, which would be heart rate, and external training load would be the applied load on the person. Garmin also makes a version of this as a foot pod, or not a foot pod, but it's a pod that can clip on the back of your shorts, and the technology is the same. It's just a triaxial accelerometer that basically measures how quickly our center mass is moving up and down or side to side. So the metrics that come out of that are the same, and again, a little bit less, I think, cumbersome for the athlete because it's not going across their chest. You can just clip on the back of their shorts.
I think the thing to also think about, Richard, with a lot of this stuff is how does the data come back, right? So the Garmin's and that kind of stuff comes back. Really, they're designed for the runner, the everyday runner, to kind of get the information and use it. Whereas it sounds like, the foot sensors and the pressure mapping of the foot is a little bit more, we'll call it techie, and maybe the data doesn't come back nearly as marketable or pretty for the average runner to kind of consume. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm really interested to hear Jenna's opinion and her experiences with these. But what we find is that if a runner can put it on and wear it, and I think that user interface is really critical for them, because if they can't use it and without having a lot of hindrances to them getting out the door and go for a run and messing around with, I don't know, a mobile app or something like that, that's a little bit hard to work with, then I think they're not going to use it. And I think that, of course, if you're not using the data, it's not going to be very helpful. But again, that's why we really like the Garmin ecosystem, because you come in the door, if you got your app open on your phone, it auto updates it or loads it to the cloud, and then the athletes we work with give us permission to take a look at their Garmin Connect account, and then we can pull the data down out of that and work with that from there.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that too. I think and from a clinician standpoint too, depending on what wearables you have and how that feedback is, we only have so much time in the clinic too. So if we're getting this data in, if it's something that's more easily digestible even for us, or is kind of going through a lot of that analysis process and kind of providing very discrete results instead of just a whole spreadsheet, which some of these might come out as, where you have to go through and interpret it a little bit more. So from that standpoint too, just for clinicians, having it more easily digestible is definitely, and user-friendly is more helpful.
There's a question here that came across from Connor. Let's just jump in and answer that real quick. I heard about some new wearable devices looking at nitric oxide and muscle oxygenation levels. Do any of you have any experience working with these, and what situations would they be best used for? I have not.
Yeah, I don't have too much experience with these, but the situation would be more performance related, I'm sure, with this. Looking at kind of the nitty gritty for during a workout and so forth. And I think with this as well, this could be an example where you can have the data overwhelm you and mislead you into what you're feeling. In reality, let the numbers guide you too much. I think Mark Wetmore, former CU coach, said it best when he said the best barometer is between your ears, and he didn't get too caught up with too much technology and lactate levels and all that other stuff. But yeah, this is probably more of assuming it's a real good real-time data, useful for a performance perspective in my mind, unless you're working with people with cardiovascular diseases and so forth.
Yeah, I've seen it a little bit. Used it with some of the professional runners we work with, kind of I think the Moxie monitors essentially are looking at oxygen levels. So in terms of maybe for professional or elite athletes, if you're looking to identify a limiting factor, is it is it the lungs, heart, breathing, is it, testing out different muscles, things like that. But again, I agree. It's sometimes just extra numbers and data that necessarily are that maybe that extra 1%, but aren't the huge causative thing to focus on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree. It's not a metric that I have a lot of familiarity with, but it does seem like something that's probably going to be useful for, Jenna, as you were saying, a very select runner who's got a very specific question in mind.
Next question here. And we kind of started talking about this a little bit earlier, but when do you not recommend using a wearable? Like, who would that person look like when they come in your door?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's, and I think in terms of whether it's who it's not working for or who it is working for, I honestly think wearables can be useful for a variety of populations, variety of people. I think it comes down to circumstance, timing, like situation, and like your goals and why you're doing it. In terms of when it's not useful, I think it's just going into it, like making sure you're also understanding all the other things that make up the whole person. So if you're, testing someone, like I'm testing one of my athletes, and because I'm, looking at certain like efficiency of how they're running or things like that. But what if it's not like a biomechanical issue? What if it's they're iron deficient, or they are overtrained, or there's something other like deeper going on with them, and like just understanding like those aspects as well, rather than just focusing like on the wearable piece. So I think they can have a time and place, but I think it's just being cautious about like always relying on them, and like being, again, very specific about a reason why you're using it for that reason.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a time and a place for a lot of this stuff. I think oftentimes, and I think we talked about this before we jumped on, Jen, about, sometimes joining several different types of tech together to kind of put the whole puzzle together. Oftentimes if we're just looking at something with an eye, or with our, slow iPhone, slow speed camera on the iPhone, you get some good information, and sometimes tech can help validate maybe what you're seeing, and maybe help quantify it a little bit to the best of maybe the apparatus ability. Obviously there's some limitations and such in some of the data, whether it be, drift and noise and some of those type of things that kind of come into the system. But, like, for example, if you have like an IMU that gives you some type of measurement, I'm going to just say, for example, like a pelvic drop, if you're wearing like a sacral IMU, looking at, how great are we at detecting pelvic drop to a certain, quantifying that two-dimensionally with a video camera? Not very good, right? Especially when clothes are kind of getting into the way and you can't really identify landmarks very well. It kind of helps a little bit validate, but I think the biggest thing is you got to pick your patients wisely as to who you use it with, because there are some patients I've come in contact with where any data is too much data, right? They get the paralysis by analysis kind of thing, and they start to dwell on numbers, and they start dwelling too much on symmetry, and we all know that we're not built symmetrically. Although we try to strive for symmetry in a lot of situations, we're not always built symmetrically. So I think trying to look at side-to-side differences is important, but we just need to take it all with a grain of salt.
So Scott, that made me think about this. Where's an easy point for us to jump in if we're new to wearables and our patients are bringing in their Garmin's, their whatever they might have? What are some of the data points that we should maybe consider looking at with them, or what are some of the ones that you guys have had success with?
I think the easy ones are the watches, right? They all have it. A lot of like, your cadence, your steps, all of that is helpful. They even do stride length, some of them, and your heart rate monitors are great. I am a big fan of some of the cheaper IMUs out there that give you some information on spatial temporal stuff as well. I think it'd be helpful. And oftentimes they're at a price point where it's not cost prohibitive for a runner to buy it themselves, and to, not just use it as a clinical evaluation tool, but also as a training tool for the runner themselves. So I think that's another point to this. And again, some of the interfaces are really nice with regards to how they're presentable to the patient or the runner, with regards to like pretty graphs, and they're very easy to manipulate different numbers and to kind of tell a story, so to speak, that the runner can easily visualize and understand, right? So I think data visualization is an overlooked component, because if somebody were to give me a spreadsheet of numbers and values, that's not going to be taken in very well by myself. But if I see graphs that show right versus left differences, and they're color coded, and certain numbers maybe are a certain color based on where they are in the range, again, we need to take those numbers with a grain of salt sometimes, but at the same point, they can kind of help steer us in a certain direction and help guide some of the treatments we're doing.
Does anyone got an example of a recent time that they used, cadence or anything like that, pelvic drop? What device you used, and what kind of cues you gave, and how did you manipulate that over time?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really common piece of biofeedback that we use a lot. We tend to use it a lot just in that return to run process. I think it can be really helpful for the runner who's recovering from a bone stress injury or from patellofemoral pain to make that bridge from their walk to run program to continuous running. And we use it a lot. And for me, we have them, maybe run outside, because your running cadence out over ground is typically about 3 to 5 steps per minute slower than running on treadmill. So if you do your gait analysis on a treadmill, it's really important to understand if they're running 178 or 183 steps per minute, you need to think about subtracting about 3% off of that. And then from there, we use our targets, and we typically do 5% to 7.5% over their baseline running cadence. And we stick with that because I know some papers go the whole way up to 10%, but we see in a lot of runners that the metabolic cost of running starts to increase at that point. And so if that happens, we know that the likelihood that they're going to be able to maintain that higher cadence probably goes down quite a bit. And so we find that most runners do really quite well with 5 to 7.5%. So a good example would be, we had a high school runner come in recently who was dealing with medial tibial stress syndrome. You mentioned cross country season starting to ramp up, and so medial tibial stress syndrome is an injury that for the most part we try to keep our runners running with, particularly the high school runner, because we know how important physical activity is for adolescents, and I think for the most part it's a load management issue. And so if we can work with the athlete and try to come up with a solution that reduces their pain or hopefully makes their pain go away with it when they're running, then that's what we want to do. And so we'll have people come into the lab and we'll try out a couple different solutions. It's really hard to tell for them. We usually try like a 10 millimeter heel lift in each shoe to see if that reduces their plantar flexor forces enough to reduce their tibial bone forces and reduces their medial tibial stress related pain. The other thing you might try, to be running in some different shoe designs, but also like a foot orthoses, for instance, that gives them a little bit more midfoot support. But running cadence is one of the things that's the easiest to do. And again, we mentioned that almost every runner has a GPS watch, and pretty much all of them give the ability to do that. So we'll run through all 3 of those. Let's try the heel lift out. Let's go and try the higher cadence. What have you, and then we'll see if it's which one's going to reduce the pain the most. But almost without fail, it ends up being running with a little bit of higher cadence can be most helpful for most runners.
Yeah, I would say too, that's the most common thing that I tend to do with a lot of the athletes with various injuries or things that they're coming in with, is like, that's one of the first things I touch on, is working on increasing cadence, and using the wearables is almost like a biofeedback kind of thing for themselves, like real-time feedback. A lot of the research I did in my PhD was looking at kind of combining wearables with like music and like improving different parameters of gait as well, and kind of using that music at a target as kind of this feedback for the person to kind of latch onto and kind of increase that like automaticity of it. Cause it can be hard to, or awkward for people to like change their running pattern like that. So sometimes it's easy when like it's a music thing or some sort of feedback system, whether visual feedback, sometimes I've done that as well, of some sort, just so that they're able to latch onto something to get that as well.
Yeah, the feedback part I think is a good point, and I think I'm interested to hear how others do it. But I know we've done it a couple different ways with cadence. We always just use the Garmin. We've done it where it's called self-controlled feedback, where they just look at the watch whenever they want the feedback. But when we know the person's going to be running at a fairly stable speed and they're going to be running fairly flat, like for instance on a treadmill during a return to run process, we might you can set up in a Garmin bandwidth feedback, so you can give like a high, like a ceiling, and then a floor, basically like a zone, and they don't get like an alarm goes off if they fall outside of that. And so bandwidth feedback, as we all know from PT school, can be really effective for helping someone learn a new movement pattern, a new motor control pattern. And so that's one that we find works pretty well, particularly with high school runners, because they often are not maybe as worried about that, whereas like maybe our, I don't know, past adolescent runner who's more performance oriented is going to be very data driven. I think most of our high school runners we find are maybe perhaps the opposite of that.
Do you guys have it? There's a lot of talk about workload, arbitrary units, and how RPE is often used to help quantify that and so forth. And that's becoming more common now. Have you implemented RPE rate numbers with a wearable, or how that might look, or have you seen any correlation with that?
I think it's great for early runners, for younger runners to understand, their RPE and maybe correlate it with their heart rate and see where they're at, see how hard they're working and how hard they think they're working. I think is a good tool. We do it a lot with regards to injury and return to run after injury. Hey, listen, gauge your next run at an RPE of 6 based on the fact that we don't want to push it too hard, we don't want to generate too much force into the ground, those type of things. So yeah, I think it could be helpful from that perspective.
And then if there that does seem helpful and so forth, do you think there are any, when you think about some of the data that we're getting from all of our wearables that we have, which data points do you feel like are outside of cadence? Are there other ones that you feel are pretty useful for return to run time and to help kind of guide that?
Sometimes if you can capture stride length, then sometimes that could be like helpful from a wearable standpoint. If especially in certain athletes, if I'm seeing cadence helps this, but it's just a supplement to it. Like if I'm seeing significant overstriding or something like that, for example, just to gain some insight into that a little bit to see if it's changing at all. But I know addressing cadence would be the biggest factor there and can play into that. But especially more in my research, stride length was a huge thing. I looked at, as well as variability was another component that I looked at a lot. Variability is linked to, or has been suggested to be linked to more of this automaticity as well of running, walking, anything like that. So kind of just understanding that has been a useful component in the past for me with individuals.
Hey, Rich, I'm curious as to your thought on this with regards to some of the IMUs that are out there that give you vertical ground reaction forces and horizontal ground reaction forces. How useful do you find those values or that information for you, especially with regards to a lot of the work you're doing with bone stress injuries?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think this is an area that's really kind of rapidly evolving from both a wearable standpoint, but also our ability to quantify these loads in the lab. So we used to use a lot of these accelerometers or inertial measurement units. So this is a really popular one. This is one that's it goes onto the tibia. It has a strap that comes with it, but again, it's bright orange and most people don't want to wear it. So we actually end up using, and it also isn't really uncomfortable too. So we use Coban to attach it. And these are nice. The user interface is really quite slick with these. So there's ease of use, which is really super helpful. But the biggest problem with these is that they don't seem to correlate very well with bone loads. And the reason is they're looking at accelerations of the leg as it hits the ground. And so we've always been kind of hammered into us, looking at impact forces. But really what you find is that the runners who land softer, there's a reason why they're landing softer, and that's because they're using their muscles to attenuate their impacts. And a classic example of this is a 4-foot striker. Their impact forces are quite low, but the reason why they're landing so softly on the ground is because they're using their plantar flexors to land softer. And so, in fact, those are the people who have really high tibial bone forces. So it's not surprising we see a lot of bone stress injuries in 4-foot strikers and their tibia and foot and ankle. So we have largely moved away from those. An inertial measurement unit is just it's still measuring accelerations. And so whether, this is the same thing, this is an inertial measurement unit too. And so we use this quite a bit. And with that, we get a pretty good estimate of the peak vertical ground reaction force. And that is a reflection of the energy that is being absorbed by the person. And that's in mid stance. And that occurs in basically temporally synced up with when tibial bone force is at its greatest. And it correlates quite well with tibial bone force when you're looking at running over ground flat. It starts to go out the window when you start running declines or inclines. So that's why we've started moving more to an inertial measurement unit on the chest, is because we can really look at that quite a bit. So we also give you that you mentioned the symmetry part too, and that part's really helpful. We use that a lot with our athletes that are trying to run after ACL reconstruction. They tend to have a really hard time keeping their injured limb on the ground long enough to bend the knee, and that's the biggest issue, is they're not attenuating a lot of load at the knee, so they're landing kind of stiff-legged. And so this device, and it's nice because on the Garmin it'll give you your says right left balance on there, and so we'll have our athletes use that a lot in that return run process after an ACL reconstruction. It seems to be really helpful with helping them kind of normalize their symmetry with their knee extensor moment when they're running. So that's, I think, when we probably use them more. In other words, getting them away from the ground and getting them closer to the center of mass, because I think that's the most helpful, because really what you're looking at, you care most about the acceleration of the person's center of mass.
So I've been using some recently myself, and again, no affiliation or whatever, but I use the Run Scribe a little bit, and it's on the dorsal aspect of the foot in essence. Yep. And it gives you accelerations of things like maximum pronation velocity, time to maximum pronation. Do you find, Jenna or Rich or Matt, do any of you guys find that information? We know that pronation doesn't necessarily correlate with running related injuries, et cetera, right? But if in a case you wanted to find out how fast somebody pronated, how much they pronated, how much, rear foot eversion or whatever mechanics you're trying to quantify, do you find that those type of units do a good job of that?
I feel like I'm biased because I think it does a little bit, but I think it also, it's so hard to know. We got a big, long kinetic chain of other variables too that might be impacting that and so forth. So it's really hard to put too much value into any one metric, I still feel like. So I'm always taking every single thing, the rate of pronation, whatever it might be, with a grain of salt, knowing that there's a big issue here, or a lot going into it. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think like understanding what's normal for that person compared to both sides, like have they had any injury, things like that too, because the body's going to find the most efficient way to move, like for that person too, and sometimes we can like adjust certain things, but trying to like fully adjust someone's form or something like that, like if that's just how their body wants to move to, and understanding if that's always been like that, or again, normal compared to the other side, like if it's continuous throughout their run or if it's at certain points, kind of like understanding all those factors are super important too.
I think it's cool when you actually have a runner that's in pain, you see metrics, you impose some type of change, however you might be, and then you see the metrics again come out after the change, and let's say their pain went down, what changed in their metrics, and how does that correlate with what's going on with you as a clinician, what you think is really. So again, we can't take our brains out of the equation here, right? We have to make these changes or what have you based on things that we see and identify as maybe problematic. And then you take a piece of evidence here, you take a subjective report of pain here, and you kind of put it all together, and what kind of picture do you get? That's where I think is the most use we can get out of a lot of these.
I have this paradigm just come up, Rich, and this you were talking about bone stress injuries and how our understanding is not so much the impacts, but the plantar flexors bending and putting stress on the tibia, for example, and then how we use cadence, increased cadence. Doesn't that kind of shift towards more of a plantar flex like bias type of load for our runners then?
Yeah, I mean, what it does.
Backfired on you.
Yeah. So a higher cadence, really, there are some kinematic things that occur.
Okay.
But the biggest thing is because when you take a long step, we're basically like a pogo stick running down the road. And if you take a longer stride length, as Jenna was saying earlier, you have to get your center mass higher off the ground. And so the higher your center mass is off the ground during the flight phase, the higher your potential energy is, which means you have to absorb more of that energy from a kinetic energy standpoint in mid-stance. And so while there might be some kinematic changes that are occurring with a higher cadence, really what you're doing is you're actually reducing the amount of load, the energy per step that person is absorbing. And so it really comes down to the person's or the control of their center of mass. You do so. In other words, the forces are going to basically trump any kinematic changes that you end up seeing. You do land with a slightly flatter foot strike with a higher running cadence, but when you do that, one of the things that happens is that the center of pressure under your foot does not end up being like at your forefoot like it is with the forefoot strike necessarily. It still basically stays in a very similar position. Okay. So the force that's going to rotate the foot back into dorsiflexion ends up being less. And so as a result of that, your plantar flexor forces end up going down. We don't, and I think a big part of that too is when we cue people to increase their cadence. We don't tell them how to do it. We just say, okay, see this number on your watch. We just want you to get that number up. And it's up to them to solve that problem from a kinematic solution standpoint on their own, because that solution might be different for you, from for me, from other runners. And so we tend not to be very prescriptive about how to do that. And what we find is that after they go out and practice that movement pattern for a while, a lot of times it'll evolve over time. And I suspect they're probably finding the most metabolically efficient way to increase their running cadence. So that may be part of it. So in other words, they might feel it a little bit more at the beginning, and maybe in the plantar flexors, but after they go out and practice it, it might flip back to something that might be more optimal for them.
Awesome, thanks. So we've talked about a lot of like data that we get from while we're running. What about the data when we're not running? Our sleep numbers and those type of things, our heart rate variability and waking or resting heart rate and those type of things. I know a lot of my athletes have been asking me more and more about that now. What are your thoughts there? Are there certain things that you put more weight on? Are there certain things that you want to see your athletes log, for example, and bring that in with them?
Yeah, I think understanding, like sleep is so important in recovery and such, and like all those components. And I think, some people, like I have athletes who do like to track that. I think there's caution there too. I have other athletes who are just very anxious about numbers, and then they can't fall asleep or sleep because they're so anxious about getting sleep and what their numbers are going to say, and are like, oh, I can't do my workout today, or because my recovery is not good or something, and are kind of weighing their day-to-day choices just based on that. Like, I think it's a good tool to like have, again, additional information, or if for some reason they're not feeling great a certain day, like understanding like, oh, well, like, how was your sleep, or how was, those other components, and understanding that is great. But again, I just think it's like some certain athletes get too wrapped up in it and like get too anxious about it, which then like can alter the actual like outcome we're hoping for with it.
Yeah, I would put myself in that boat maybe a little bit. I don't have a hard time falling asleep necessarily, but when I wake up the next day and I'm like, oh, I feel a little groggy, and I look at my watch. My sleep score isn't what I want it to be. I'm like, well, there you go. That's the reason why. And the next thing you know, like, there goes my day, kind of thing. So I think it can be a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, but I don't know, it can be really helpful, I think, at the same time. So I think for the right person, I think like putting constraints on like how you're looking and using that data, I think can be really important. But I don't know. I think there can be an obsessive component to looking at data that I think we need to be a little mindful of. And a lot of these metrics, as kind of talking about a little bit, some of them are quite good and quite valid, and others maybe not quite as good. And I wonder a little bit about some of these metrics we get out of these wearable devices. I know some are quite better than others. Like I know like the Oura Ring, for instance, is quite accurate. I know some of the other, like the Garmin devices, maybe perhaps less so when it comes to some of these metrics.
I think we at the school I work with have had whole teams be given or purchased, whether it be the Whoop or whether it be the Oura Ring. We've gone back and forth between some of those. And, at college, it's always tough because you have athletes that have class, they have practice, they have tutoring, they have workouts in the gym, and they like to go out on Friday nights and party. And they don't like somebody keeping an eye on them. Like, they don't want Big Brother watching them all the time and saying, hey, you need to get more sleep. What did you do on Saturday night? Right. So that's always that balance that we kind of have to come up with. But most of them, especially now it's becoming more and more popular, I think a lot of them have adapted to it and really like it. The question, I think, comes from, okay, you have this person on a team that has a poor readiness score, let's call it, for lack of a better term. Is anything getting adjusted as a result of that score? Yes or no? And I think that's where the rubber hits the road, right? So what are we doing about this? Are we truly adjusting based on the data, or are we just kind of collecting data to collect data and kind of maybe make some associations for the athlete where they could say, hey, yeah, I felt like crap today during practice. Oh, that's why I looked at my watch and my readiness score was terrible. Or are we doing something about it?
Yeah, no, I was at the Elite Basketball Rehab Conference a couple weeks ago. And Jess Ellis was one of the presenters. He's the vice president of health for the New York Knicks. And he actually just wrapped up his PhD. And what he just talked about was what he studied for his dissertation was his exact topic, which is like who owns the data, and basically like what are the limits, and what do we need to be careful of as far as like healthcare practitioners. And the big one he talked about was sleep, and how really you probably should just keep the sleep metrics, I think, probably just to the athlete because of some privacy concerns, for a lot of reasons too. Like I don't know, like my wife goes out of town to go for a work trip. She just went out of town a couple weeks ago, and I was staying up kind of late. I don't know, and it's just like it just objectively it looks weird, and so I think that there's I don't know, I think there's some data privacy issues that I think these are some things that Wearable's been around for a while now, but I think we're still starting to work through some of these issues, like who owns the data, who should be looking at it. It's a lot different than like, okay, like here's your side-to-side asymmetry versus like, okay, here's your nighttime activity, your sleeping activity kind of thing, if you will.
Yeah, Jenna, have you had any pushback from some of the higher level athletes around Boulder with like privacy about like maybe what kind of workouts they're doing or anything? Like you don't want, have you heard any like worries about that type of information getting out there?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, like, I think, for the most part, like I personally haven't had, pushback in terms of that. And I think a lot of it's like, usually they trust, it's like building that trust with a clinician, or that you're not going around like, sharing those things or whatnot. And a lot of the time, like in terms of like a, Strava or something like that, like I'm not necessarily looking like, at what they're entering or anything like that. It might be like more objectively like, oh, like, what were like, how many miles did you have? What was kind of the intensity, like general workouts. And I try to keep it, more to that. And if they're more like willing to share certain aspects of like the specific workouts, unless it's like more of like a return to run program where I'm kind of like more programming that for them. But if they're just coming in for general things and like, kind of like their willingness to it. And some are very open about like, oh, I did this specific workout and these are my paces, and they like want to share that. And others are kind of, you can tell if they're a little more, keep it to themselves a little bit more. But I haven't necessarily had like pushback in terms of like sharing, just, some people are a little bit more open, but I think it's just building trust. And I think a lot of them trust you, and that you're not going to be using that information in a bad way.
I think wearables are also becoming really, really common in sports, right? Obviously, runners were probably one of the first to early adopt that. But now if you look at things, during football practice at every level, soccer practice, the catapults are being worn everywhere. All the data that is really helping to drive decision-making across training, across, type of practice settings, all of that data is kind of being utilized. I think more and more athletes are really, accepting the fact that this technology has value, has a lot to help. And I think it's there for a reason, right? The reason why we use this is to limit injuries, improve performance, to kind of make the output of that athlete is at the highest level possible, right? When you're talking about professional sports, collegiate sports, even amateur sports, but really at the highest level, it's all about, it's about dollars, right? And it's about trying to put the best product on the field or the best performance on the track, what have you. And I think the more and more, data scientists kind of come into the spectrum of sports rehab. And I think the more common that we kind of utilize that data and see that data being utilized on a day in, day out basis, I think the technology is only going to improve because people are wanting to get more and more of it out there.
Yeah, that gets me thinking. Do you guys see that there's more patients coming in and bringing you their information and show to the eval, and they're like, look at this. This has to be what's wrong with me. And how do I fix this? Or do you feel like it's been a useful educational platform for helping our patients, or do you think it's a hindrance? And
we use, like, if there's one metric that I use the most with the patients that I work with a lot of trail runners, and some of them are really quite high level trail runners too. But we use vertical gain a lot from the devices, because a lot of the injuries that we see are foot and ankle, which is going to be running up hills, and knee injuries are running downhill. So runners sometimes can get really fixated on their weekly volume, but the total, of course, if you're running uphill, you're going to run down that hill too. So that can be really, really helpful because a lot of times the athletes are like, I don't understand what happened, why my knee got flared up. And so, well, I'm like, well, let's flip your data and let's go ahead and look at everything. So we'll look at like, the volume that they ran. And then some of them will, in Garmin, you can put in your RPE, and so you can get that score out of there too. So we'll look at that. But then, really, it almost always ends up being the amount of vertical work that they've done that has maybe flared their knee up, or perhaps they started training for a big race and they ramped their volume up. Maybe not so much from a running volume standpoint, but from an uphill volume. And then you see 2-3 weeks down the road, that's when their injury popped up. So I think looking at the data very objectively, and we know that big spikes in training load, there's a lag between when an injury is going to show up. I think like being able to go back and look in time and say, okay, well, what happened a couple of weeks ago? What was the new thing you added? That can be really, I think, really instructive for the runner.
So that got me wondering, we give a lot of feedback on, intensity and duration and stuff like that. And forever it was 10% rule and stuff like that. There's that one suggestion outside that one time that it became a rule, right? But now, how do you got somebody interested in their vertical gain and so forth. How are you recommending training that? Is that when adding that, are you pulling back the reins on total mileage and track work and those other things, or how's that looking?
I mean, that's exactly what we do. And we find it on an individual basis, like what tends to flare up runners, like what's the jump. So it's going to differ based on the runner. And then we have them graph it out. So I have a Google sheet that they enter their data in, and then it graphs it. And then we basically use there's a ruler that we've written into the Google Sheet code that will basically turn the bar red if they get over a certain amount, meaning that they need to pull back on like their total like elevation gain like that next week. But that's typically one of the things we ask them to do is when you do that, particularly when we have an athlete returning to run after an injury, we always scale back their overall volume when they start to add speed work or they start to add any sort of hill work. Or the other thing would be going back into like a race specific shoe, like some sort of racing, like a track spike or something like that. That's a really important time to really draw back on volume. And I think, again, the GPS devices could be super helpful for that.
So you have your workload ratio that you have on there, and elevation's a component of that, elevation gain and loss. Gotcha.
Yeah, so we have a whole different tab for that they'll fill out. And, and in fact, one of the pro runners I work with, she's like, "Oh, my knees really flared up," and then and she'll text me in, and I'll be like, and then I'm like, "Okay, well, let's get you on." And then she'll text back later. She's like, "I know you're looking at my Strava data right now." and exactly what I'm doing is I'm going to our Google Sheet and I'm punching in her weekly, because she has a knee injury that flares up, and so I'm punching in that how much elevation you gain. I'm like, well, look, you doubled how many feet you gained on a week that week. And I think that might be something worth reconsidering. So, but again, I think that that's, I think, one of the problems with RPE. I think RPE can be really helpful. And I think it can misguide us, a little bit. And I think that, I don't know, I'm just a numbers guy. I really like the numbers. I think those can be really, really quite helpful. I think too, like RPE can, and like contact time, again, from those inertial measurement units can be really helpful when a runner who is like carrying some like fatigue from day to day runs. You'll start to see their cadence decrease. You'll see their contact time increase. So they're taking bigger steps, and their time their foot is on the ground is longer, and that's a really good sign that that athlete has lost some leg stiffness. They're losing some of that pop off the ground, and that's a great objective sign for an athlete that it's a good time to probably cool the jets for a couple of days and work in some extra recovery.
I don't. As far as other questions here, I don't see any in the chat. What do you guys think the future looks like for wearables right now? Where are we going with this? And we'll probably wrap up with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to keep continuing to grow. I mean, I feel like there's new things coming out all the time, and like measuring different things. So I think it's like great, like, as clinicians, as athletes and such, to like have an understanding of it, just because it is just so prevalent, and especially in the future, I think it's going to be. And I think, I mean, my hope too is that more, accurate measures, more technology that we're using in the real world, like I think Rich was mentioning earlier too, that's where they're doing the running. That's where like these injuries or things are happening. That's where their performance is. So like being able to have them on the trails, like on the track, on the roads, wherever it is, being able to understand that data a little bit better in those settings too, as compared to always just having like in a lab setting, I think is going to be really useful to us in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to build on what Jenna said. I think two things. I think hopefully maybe not so much a device, but some sort of standardized validation system, so that the consumer understands that what they're buying is a truly a validated metric. What ends up happening is that these metrics come out, these devices come out, and then it's several years later we start getting the validation studies that are coming out, and we're like, oh, maybe these devices aren't so good. And a lot of people have been making some big time decisions based off whatever they're purported to be telling us. So I think there's that. I think the one, and we're starting to use, I work with a group of physiologists here, but I really think one big one that's we're probably going to see in the future is going to be skin temperature, and monitoring skin temperature as heat stress becomes a bigger and bigger issue. And skin temperature is a leading indicator of your high core temperature, because that's how you're ridding your body of heat, and heat injury is becoming again much more common issue. And so that would be the big one that I would say is just looking at skin temperature. I really do think that we'll see more and more of those devices coming on the market, and hopefully they're doing what they say that they're doing.
I agree with everything you're saying. I think as technology increases and improves, I think we've just scratched the surface of what we can do with science. I think getting the ability to, improve upon the IMU data. I think, looking at joint angles and rotations, transverse plane motion is something that's obviously something very, very important that we do a very poor job of being able to identify outside the lab, right? So you get it in the lab, you do okay, but once you take it out on the road, or the average person doesn't have that information. And I agree with Rich 100%. If some of these platforms come out there with data upon data upon data, of which some of it's probably really good and some of it's probably not good, and being able to decipher what is valuable and what's not, and I think a lot of it still relies on the interpretation of the person. Maybe reading the values and not just making a jump from a cause and effect relationship, and understanding that maybe there is a link and maybe there's not a link. And sometimes numbers are just numbers and symmetry is just symmetry, and it doesn't always line up the way you expect it to. But I think just like Rich said, numbers, he's a numbers guy. I like numbers too. And I think quantifying the ability to look at certain characteristics of how somebody runs or walks or moves is really, really cool and really, really valuable. But I think we just need to use it smart early on until we truly understand its limitations. I think that's something we really didn't talk much about, Matt, is like, what's the limitations in some of this stuff? Like we talked about, do some of these pieces of tech need to be calibrated? How often do they need to be calibrated? How, what is the calibration method? Does things in the environment play a factor? Like, does heat, like Rich was talking about skin, like how does heat play with the interface of the sensor, if at all, right? So I think those are all important things that we need to continue to develop an understanding of. And, but I think there's value in wearable tech. I just think we just need to understand what the limitations are too.
Yep. 100% agree. I just think about, just like Scott, you got your experience with that as well. So like when these are validated, like you have your course that you run on, and you calibrate it to that distance, it's significantly more reliable, the distance, for example, with that IMU, for example. I can't ever identify a race that I've been in where I've had two runners go, oh, I have the same distance as you on my Garmin afterwards. They're always like, they measure the course wrong. I ran 27 miles or this or that. And that doesn't happen. So the reliability and validity is something we're learning, I'm sure. And I'm guessing that'll get tighter in the future. So.
Awesome. Well, guys, first, from the American Academy of Sports Physical Therapy perspective, I want to say thank Rich, thank Jenna, and thank Matt for being here for this. Hope you guys have enjoyed it. If you're watching this after the fact, when you have a question, feel free to reach out to me or anybody on the panel here. I'm sure they'd be happy to answer any questions you have. this recording will be up, hopefully for eternity, for people to throw darts at and to laugh at. But if you're looking for more information about the American Academy of Sports Physical Therapy, head over to the website. We have conferences. There's more content on that site with regards to, journal clubs and webinars and those type of things. More content with experts such as these that will be more than happy to share their knowledge with you. So again, I want to thank everyone here for spending their time with us, and thank you guys for watching and listening. And if you haven't done it already, this is the typical, I'm not a social media guy, but hit the like and subscribe. I think that's what they say. That's what the kids say. So do that, hit the like, subscribe. We're going to do one of these every single month. This one was sponsored by the Running Special Interest Group, obviously. We have one already on the page that was sponsored by the HIP Special Interest Group. And we have a whole host of other special interest groups, whether it be the female athlete, whether it be the college and pro sports special interest group, sports performance, knee, shoulder, you name it, we got it. So hope to see you back soon with more content. And thanks again for joining us. Hope you guys had a great time.
Awesome.
Thank you.